Montana Territory, 1875. The unforgiving wind howled across the plains like a vengeful spirit, carrying with it the promise of the season's first blizzard. Jack Irwin pulled his coat tighter around his lean frame, squinting through the thickening snow. At 25, he'd already spent 7 years working cattle, and he knew better than to be caught out in weather like this. But the stray calves wouldn't find themselves, and Thornfield Ranch couldn't afford any losses. "Nothing worth finding out here anymore," he muttered to his horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Copper. "No point in looking for something that don't want to be found." Jack had lived by that philosophy since watching his father die of a broken heart after his mother passed from fever 3 winters back. Love was a liability on the frontier, a weakness that could destroy a man faster than any bullet. The West was no place for tender feelings, only survival. A man alone could adapt, move quick, make hard choices without hesitation. Attachment only led to devastation when the harsh realities of frontier life inevitably tore everything away. He was about to turn back toward the ranch when Copper suddenly tossed his head, ears pricked forward toward something in the distance. Jack squinted through the curtain of white, making out what appeared to be the dark shape of an overturned wagon half buried in a snowdrift. "Easy, boy," he soothed, nudging Copper forward, probably abandoned, he figured. No one would be fool enough to travel in this weather. As they drew closer, Jack noticed fresh tracks partially filled with snow. Recent. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip as he approached with caution. Outlaws sometimes used such tactics to lure in unsuspecting travelers. The wagon lay on its side, one wheel spinning lazily in the wind. Supplies were scattered across the ground, rapidly disappearing beneath the accumulating snow. No sign of horses, they'd either broken free or been taken. He was about to call out when he spotted her. Huddled against the protected side of the wagon was a young woman, her blue dress nearly white with snow, a thin shawl clutched around her shoulders. She was attempting to shield herself from the brunt of the storm, but even from horseback, Jack could see she was shivering violently. "Ma'am," he called, dismounting quickly. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" She looked up, revealing a face that, despite being pale with cold, struck him with its beauty. Large green eyes dominated her features, and golden blonde hair escaped from beneath a snow-dusted bonnet. "Oh, thank heavens," she breathed, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I thought I would die out here." Jack knelt beside her, noting no visible injuries but recognizing the early signs of exposure. "Can you stand? We need to get you somewhere warm right away." "I think so," she said, attempting to rise but stumbling. Jack caught her by the elbows, surprised by how light she felt despite the sodden dress. "What happened?" he asked, helping her to her feet. "The horses spooked in the storm. Wagon hit something and overturned. The team broke free," she spoke through chattering teeth. "My driver went after them hours ago. Never returned." Jack nodded grimly. A man on foot chasing panicked horses in a blizzard had slim chances. "I'm Jack Irwin. I work at Thornfield Ranch, about 4 miles east." "It's your best chance in this weather." "Grace Sutton," she replied, clutching his arm for support. "I was traveling to Helena to stay with my aunt." "That's another 60 miles north, Miss Sutton." "You won't be making that journey today." Jack glanced at her thin shoes, already noting the dangerous paleness of her fingers. "Can you ride?" She nodded weakly, and he helped her toward Copper, who stood patiently in the storm. "What about my things?" she asked, looking back at the wagon. "They'll have to wait." "This storm's only getting worse." He hoisted her onto Copper's back, noting how her breath came in small, white puffs. "We'll send men back when it's safe." Jack mounted behind her, circling one arm securely around her waist while taking the reins with his free hand. He felt her stiffen momentarily before she relaxed against him, likely too cold to maintain propriety. "Hold on tight, Miss Sutton," he instructed, turning Copper toward the ranch, "and stay awake. No matter how tired you feel, you must stay awake." As they rode through the intensifying blizzard, Jack found himself unusually aware of the woman pressed against him. Her golden hair occasionally whipped against his face, carrying the faint scent of lavender despite the snow and wind. He'd helped plenty of strangers in trouble before, it was the code of the West, but something about this rescue felt different. Dangerous thoughts, he reminded himself. Attachment was vulnerability, and vulnerability got men killed out here. He'd get her to safety, help her on her way, and that would be the end of it. Little did Jack know that the slender woman shivering against him would change everything he believed about survival and solitude on the frontier. Grace Sutton had just turned 20 years old when her parents died within months of each other, leaving her with few options beyond accepting her aunt's invitation to come west. The journey from Philadelphia had been long and difficult, but nothing had prepared her for the ferocity of a Montana blizzard or the intensity of the man who had appeared like an apparition in the swirling white. The ride to Thornfield Ranch passed in a blur of numbing cold and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them. Jack spoke occasionally, urging her to stay alert, asking simple questions that required responses. She answered mechanically, her mind foggy with cold, aware only of his solid presence behind her and the arm that held her securely. By the time the buildings of Thornfield Ranch emerged through the snow, Grace was barely conscious. She was vaguely aware of shouts, of being lifted down from the horse, of being carried into blessed warmth. "Get Mrs. Cooper," Jack's voice seemed to come from far away. "And blankets, all the blankets you can find." Grace felt herself being lowered onto something soft, then the weight of heavy blankets. A motherly woman appeared, clucking with concern as she removed Grace's sodden outer garments and replaced them with something warm and dry. "The poor dear is half frozen," the woman said. "What were you thinking, Jack Irwin, bringing her in on horseback in this weather?" "Would you rather I left her to die by her overturned wagon, Mrs. Cooper?" Jack's voice had an edge Grace hadn't heard before. "Don't you take that tone with me, young man. I practically raised you after your mother passed." "Sorry, Mrs. Cooper, I'm just worried about her." The housekeeper's expression softened. "She'll be fine. Young ladies are stronger than they look. Now go change out of those wet clothes before you catch your death too." Grace drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of a fire crackling nearby and the occasional touch of a cool hand on her forehead. When she finally awakened fully, sunlight was streaming through windows that framed a pristine white world outside. "Ah, she rejoins the living," came a cheerful voice. Grace turned to see the older woman from her hazy memories bustling toward her with a steaming mug. She appeared to be in her 50s with gray-streaked brown hair and kind eyes. "Mrs. Cooper," Grace guessed, her voice raspy. "That's right, dear, Martha Cooper, housekeeper for Thornfield these past 15 years. She helped Grace sit up and press the mug into her hands. "Drink this, it's beef broth with a touch of whiskey, best thing for exposure." Grace sipped gratefully, feeling warmth spread through her chest. She glanced around the room, a comfortable parlor with simple but solid furniture. "How long have I been asleep?" "Nearly a full day. That storm was one for the record books, still snowing but not nearly so fierce." Mrs. Cooper adjusted Grace's blankets. "Jack's been asking after you every hour. Never seen that boy so concerned about anyone." Grace felt her cheeks warm slightly. "He saved my life. I owe him a great debt." "Nonsense. Any decent man would have done the same." Mrs. Cooper patted her hand. "Though I must say, Jack taking an interest in anyone is noteworthy. That young man's been determined to live like a hermit since his father passed." Before Grace could inquire further, the parlor door opened, and Jack himself entered, looking somewhat different than she remembered. Without his heavy coat and hat, she could see he was tall and broad-shouldered, with light brown hair that fell across his forehead. His face was clean-shaven save for slight stubble, revealing a strong jaw and features that were undeniably handsome. His eyes, she noticed, were a striking blue, like the summer sky so absent in the white world outside. He paused when he saw she was awake, an unreadable expression crossing his face. "Miss Sutton," he said with a nod. "Glad to see you're recovering." "Thanks to you, Mr. Irwin." Grace straightened, suddenly aware she was wearing borrowed nightclothes beneath the blankets. "I cannot thank you enough for your bravery." "Just doing what needed doing," he replied, his stance somewhat awkward. "The men tried to reach your wagon this morning, but the snow's too deep. We'll get your belongings once the weather clears. I understand. I'm grateful enough to be alive. Mrs. Cooper glanced between them with thinly veiled interest before clearing her throat. Well, I should check on dinner. The ranch hands will be mighty hungry after tending the herd in this weather. She patted Grace's shoulder. Rest now, dear. You're welcome here as long as you need. After the housekeeper left, an uncomfortable silence fell. Jack remained by the door as though reluctant to come closer. Mr. Thornfield, your employer, he doesn't mind having a stranger imposed upon his household, Grace finally asked. A fleeting smile crossed Jack's face. I'm Mr. Thornfield, more or less. The ranch belonged to my father. When he passed 2 years ago, I took over running it. Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Cooper mentioned, she trailed off, unsure if she should reference what the housekeeper had said about his solitary nature. Mrs. Cooper talks too much, he said, though without real annoyance. My father built this place after my mother died. Named it after her family. I keep it going because it's all I have left of them both. The raw honesty in his voice touched something in Grace. She recognized the pain of loss that they shared, despite their different backgrounds. I understand loneliness, Mr. Irwin, she said softly. My parents died within 3 months of each other last year. My father from heart failure, my mother from what the doctor called a broken spirit, though I believe it was simply that she couldn't imagine life without him. Jack's expression changed, something like recognition flashing in his eyes. He moved farther into the room, taking a seat in a chair near the fire. Mrs. Cooper says you're from Philadelphia. Yes, my father owned a shipping company. After his death, it passed to my uncle, who had little interest in supporting his brother's daughter. Grace tried to keep the bitterness from her voice. My Aunt Margaret in Helena is my mother's sister. She offered me a home when she learned of my circumstances. Jack nodded slowly. The storm might keep you here for some time. The pass to Helena often closes for weeks after a blizzard like this. Grace felt a flutter of anxiety. I don't wish to impose. It's no imposition, he interrupted, then softened his tone. Thornfield has plenty of room, and winter is our quiet season. The cattle mostly fend for themselves in the sheltered valleys until spring. Thank you, she said sincerely. I'll try to be useful during my stay. Jack's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Mrs. Cooper will appreciate the help. She's been trying to civilize a house full of cowboys for years. He stood to leave. Rest now. Dinner's at 6 if you feel up to joining us. Grace watched him go, struck by the contradiction of a man who claimed to prefer solitude, yet had opened his home to a stranger without hesitation. There was something about Jack Irwin, a quality of restrained strength and hidden depth, that intrigued her in a way no Philadelphia gentleman ever had. As she drifted back to sleep, the memory of his arm around her waist and his voice urging her to stay awake followed her into her dreams. The blizzard continued for 3 days, blanketing Thornfield Ranch in snow deep enough to reach a man's waist in some places. The ranch hands, 6 weathered men of varying ages, worked tirelessly to keep the paths between buildings clear and to check on the nearest cattle herds sheltering in the valleys. Grace regained her strength quickly and insisted on helping Mrs. Cooper with household tasks. Though her upbringing had focused more on embroidery and music than practical skills, she was a quick learner and eager to be useful. On the evening of her 3rd day at Thornfield, she was helping prepare dinner when Jack entered the kitchen, bringing a blast of cold air with him. Storm's finally breaking, he announced, stamping snow from his boots. Skies clearing to the west. Should be able to reach Miss Sutton's wagon tomorrow. Excellent news, Mrs. Cooper replied, glancing at Grace. Though we've rather enjoyed having female company, haven't we, Jack? Jack's eyes met Grace's briefly before he looked away, mumbling something noncommittal as he hung his coat on a peg by the door. How are the cattle faring? Grace asked, continuing to peel potatoes at the kitchen table. Better than expected. Lost a few strays, but the main herd found good shelter. Jack seemed surprised by her question. Most city ladies aren't interested in ranch business. I find it fascinating, Grace replied honestly. My father's ships carried goods across oceans, but I know nothing about raising the cattle that might have been among those exports." "Not much romance in it," Jack said, accepting a cup of coffee from Mrs. Cooper, "just hard work in harder weather." "Yet you choose it," Grace observed. "There must be something that keeps you here, beyond obligation to your father's legacy." Jack seemed to consider this, looking out the window at the snow-covered landscape turning golden in the late afternoon sun. "There's a freedom to it, and sometimes when the work is done and you're watching the sun set over land that you've made productive with your own hands." He trailed off, as though embarrassed by his own eloquence. "That sounds rather like romance to me, Mr. Irwin," Grace said with a small smile. Their eyes met again, and this time Jack didn't look away. Something passed between them, a moment of understanding that transcended their different backgrounds. Mrs. Cooper cleared her throat pointedly. "The men will be in soon, hungry as wolves. Grace, dear, would you mind setting the table?" The moment broken, Grace nodded and rose to her task, aware of Jack's gaze following her movements. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the world outside transformed into a glittering white expanse under a flawless blue sky. After breakfast, Jack assembled a small party to recover Grace's belongings. "I'm coming with you," Grace announced as they prepared to leave. Jack frowned. "The snow's still deep, Miss Sutton." "They're my possessions, Mr. Irwin, and I've borrowed Mrs. Cooper's clothes long enough." She gestured to the simple woolen dress and heavy shawl she wore. "Besides, I should pay my respects if we find any sign of my driver." Jack looked like he might argue, but instead nodded curtly. "You'll ride with me. And you'll need these." He handed her a pair of men's trousers. "I beg your pardon," Grace stared at the offered clothing. "To wear under your dress," he explained, "unless you want frostbite on those city-bred legs." Grace blushed furiously but took the trousers. Practical considerations outweighed propriety in the wilderness. The journey to her wagon was slow but not difficult. 2 ranch hands accompanied them, riding ahead to break a trail through the snow. Grace rode behind Jack on Copper, her arms wrapped around his waist, the borrowed trousers feeling strange but wonderfully warm beneath her skirts. "There it is," Jack pointed as they crested a small rise. Grace's heart sank at the sight of her wagon, now almost completely buried in snow. Only a corner remained visible above the massive drift that had formed around it. "We'll have to dig," Jack said as they approached. "Might take most of the day." The men set to work immediately, shoveling snow with practiced efficiency. Grace insisted on helping, though Jack objected at first. She worked alongside them, her back aching and hands growing numb despite thick gloves, but determined to contribute. By midday, they had cleared enough snow to access the wagon's contents. Grace climbed inside carefully, relieved to find her trunks intact though covered with snow that had blown in through the broken canvas cover. "My things seem largely undamaged," she called to Jack, who stood watching from outside, "though everything will need to dry." "We'll take what we can carry today and come back for the rest," he replied. "Weather should hold for a few days." As Grace sorted through her belongings, separating what she most needed from what could wait, she came across a small, leather-bound book tucked inside one of her shoes, her journal. She slipped it into her pocket with a sense of relief. Her thoughts from the journey west had been recorded there, along with her hopes and fears for the future. The men loaded what they could onto the packhorses they'd brought, then began the journey back to the ranch. As they rode, Jack suddenly reined in Copper, his body tensing. "What is it?" Grace asked, peering around his shoulder. Jack nodded toward a stand of pines about 50 yards away. "Wolves." Grace's breath caught as she spotted them, 3 gray shapes moving among the trees, watching the party with predatory interest. "Will they attack?" "Not likely, not with 4 of us and the horses making noise." Jack kept his voice steady, but Grace felt his hand move to rest on his revolver. "Still, best we keep moving." They continued at a slightly faster pace, Jack's posture alert. Grace found herself studying his profile, the determined set of his jaw, the calm confidence in his bearing. She realized with some surprise that she felt utterly safe with this man she'd known less than a week. That evening, Grace joined the ranch household for dinner in dry clothes from her own trunks, a simple blue dress that Mrs. Cooper had pressed for her. She noted Jack's appreciative glance when she entered the dining room, and a warm flutter stirred in her chest. "You look like yourself again, Miss Sutton," he commented as he held her chair. "Thank you. Though I must say, there's something liberating about wearing trousers beneath one's skirts when facing a Montana winter." A chuckle rippled around the table. The ranch hands, Ben, Hank, Miguel, Frank, Old Tom, and young Charlie, had initially been shy around Grace but were gradually warming to her presence. "Might start a new fashion back east," quipped Hank, the foreman, a weathered man in his 40s with a handlebar mustache. "My aunt would have an apoplexy," Grace replied with a smile. "She's written that Helena society has strict standards despite being a frontier town." "You still planning to continue to Helena when the pass opens?" Jack asked, his tone casual though his eyes were watchful. Grace hesitated. The question had been on her mind since recovering her belongings. "I suppose I must. My aunt is expecting me, and I have nowhere else to go." "No rush," Jack said, passing her a platter of roast beef. "Pass might not open till spring anyway." Several knowing glances were exchanged among the ranch hands, which both Jack and Grace pretended not to notice. After dinner, Grace found herself alone with Jack in the small study that had belonged to his father. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on cattle raising, Western exploration, and to her surprise, several classics of literature. "Your father was a reader," she observed, running her fingers along the leather spines. "Mother taught him." "She was a schoolteacher before they married." Jack stood by the fireplace watching her. "Father said books kept him connected to her after she died, said he could hear her voice in the words." Grace turned to him, struck by the unexpected poetry in this supposedly solitary cowboy. "You must miss them both very much." "Every day," Jack stared into the fire. "But the pain changes over time, gets less sharp, more familiar." "Yes," Grace agreed softly, "that's exactly it." A comfortable silence fell between them. Grace selected a volume of Emerson's essays and settled into an armchair. Jack remained standing for a moment, then took the chair opposite, picking up a book of his own. They read in companionable silence until the grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9. Grace reluctantly closed her book and rose. "Thank you for retrieving my belongings today," she said, "and for sharing your father's library." Jack stood as well, suddenly looking uncertain. "Miss Sutton, Grace, I want you to know you're welcome here, for as long as you need. Even if the pass opens tomorrow." The intensity in his blue eyes made Grace's heart quicken. "Thank you, Jack, that means a great deal to me." For a moment she thought he might say more, might step closer. Instead he nodded and stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Jack." As Grace climbed the stairs to her room, she found herself reconsidering her plans to continue to Helena. Her aunt was largely a stranger, and the life awaiting her there was an unknown quantity. Thornfield Ranch, in just a few days, had begun to feel surprisingly like a place she could belong. The weather held clear and cold for the next week, allowing the ranch to return to its normal winter routine. Jack and the men worked from dawn to dusk, checking on cattle, repairing equipment, and preparing for spring calving. Grace found herself settling into life at Thornfield with unexpected ease, helping Mrs. Cooper with household tasks and learning the rhythm of ranch life. She began taking daily walks to strengthen her legs after the ordeal in the storm, often wandering to the stables to watch Jack and the men work with the horses. One afternoon she stood at the corral fence as Jack broke a spirited young mare, his movements confident and gentle despite the animal's initial resistance. "She's afraid," Grace observed when Jack finally dismounted and joined her at the fence, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. "Most are at first," he replied, watching the mare trot around the corral, tossing her head. "The trick is showing them there's nothing to fear without breaking their spirit." "You're very good with her." Jack smiled slightly. "My father taught me. He said horses are like people. They respond better to kindness than force, but they need clear boundaries." "A wise man, your father." "He was." Jack leaned against the fence, his shoulder almost touching hers. "Your aunt sent a telegram." Ben picked it up in town yesterday. Grace turned to him in surprise. What did it say? She's relieved to hear you're safe. The stagecoach company reported your wagon missing after the storm. Jack pulled a folded paper from his pocket and handed it to her. She says you're welcome to stay at Thornfield until spring if the ranch owner doesn't mind. Says it's safer than trying to cross the pass before the thaw. Grace read the telegram, noting her aunt's formal tone. They had never met, and the invitation to Helena had been motivated more by family obligation than affection. "Do you mind," she asked, looking up at Jack, "having me stay until spring?" Something flickered in his eyes, a warmth that made her breath catch. "I don't mind at all." As the days passed, Grace found herself increasingly drawn to Jack. She admired his quiet competence, his genuine concern for the men who worked for him, and his deep connection to the land. He was unlike any man she had known in Philadelphia, straightforward where they had been calculating, genuinely capable where they had been merely confident. For his part, Jack seemed both attracted to Grace and wary of that attraction. She would catch him watching her across a room, his expression thoughtful, only to have him maintain a careful distance when they were alone together. One evening, about 2 weeks after her arrival, Grace was helping Mrs. Cooper prepare dinner when the housekeeper suddenly said, "He's different when you're around, you know." Grace looked up from the bread she was kneading. "I beg your pardon." "Jack," Mrs. Cooper clarified, stirring a pot of stew. "He smiles more. Talks more. Even started eating dinner with us regular-like, instead of taking his plate to his office half the time." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sure I don't have anything to do with that." Mrs. Cooper gave her a knowing look. "Child, I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. After his mother died, something closed up inside him, got worse after his father passed. He's been running this ranch like a man fulfilling a duty, not living a life." She gestured with her wooden spoon. "Until you showed up half frozen in a blizzard." "Mrs. Cooper, I'm not saying it to embarrass you, dear. I'm saying it because Jack Irwin deserves happiness, and I think you might be good for him." The older woman's expression softened. "And maybe he might be good for you too." Before Grace could respond, the kitchen door opened and Jack himself entered, stamping snow from his boots. "Smells good in here," he said, sniffing appreciatively. "Need any help?" "Mrs. Cooper shot Grace a meaningful glance before answering. "As a matter of fact, the dining room needs setting. Perhaps Grace could use your help carrying in the dishes from the sideboard. My old knees aren't fond of all these trips." Jack nodded easily, happy to help. In the dining room, Grace found herself acutely aware of Jack's presence as they worked side by side, arranging plates and silverware. "You've adapted well to ranch life," he observed. "Most city women would be counting the days until they could leave." Grace arranged a fork and knife with precision. "Perhaps I wasn't meant for city life. I've found I enjoy the simplicity here, the honest work, the clear purpose." "And the company?" Jack asked, his voice carefully neutral. Grace glanced up, meeting his eyes. "Especially the company." Something changed in Jack's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight parting of lips as though he might speak. Instead, he reached out, his fingers briefly brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You belong here," he said softly, the words seeming to surprise even him. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the front door banging open and men's voices calling urgently, "Boss! Boss, we got trouble." Jack pulled back immediately, his face transforming as he strode toward the commotion. Grace followed, her heart still racing from their interrupted moment. In the entryway stood Ben and Miguel, supporting between them a third man Grace had never seen before. The stranger's face was bloody, his clothing torn. "Found him on the north boundary," Ben explained breathlessly. "Says Wallace's men jumped him when he refused to sell his spread." "Ambrose," Jack recognized the injured man. "Get him to the sofa. Grace, fetch water and bandages." Grace hurried to comply, returning to find Jack examining the man's injuries while Mrs. Cooper hovered nearby. "3 ribs broken, I reckon," Jack was saying. "Cut on your head needs stitching." They burned my cabin, Irwin, the man called Ambrose gasped. Said next time they'd burn me with it if I didn't sign. Wallace hasn't changed his methods, I see. Jack's voice was tight with controlled anger. Who is Wallace? Grace asked as she handed clean cloths to Mrs. Cooper. Jack's eyes were hard when he looked up. Augustus Wallace, cattle baron from over Billings Way, been trying to take over every small spread in the territory. Thinks he can build an empire. He's got 20 men riding for him now, Ambrose added, wincing as Mrs. Cooper cleaned his head wound. All gunmen pretending to be cowboys. Jack's jaw tightened. How long ago? Yesterday. Rode all night to reach you. Ambrose grabbed Jack's wrist. They're heading this way, Irwin. Wallace wants Thornfield worst of all, says it's the key to controlling the valley. A cold silence fell over the room. Grace looked from face to face, seeing grim understanding in each. We knew this was coming, Ben said finally. Wallace has been picking off the small ranches one by one, working his way toward us. But why? Grace asked. There's so much land out here. Water, Jack replied simply. Thornfield controls the headwaters of 3 creeks that feed the whole valley. My father chose this location carefully. He stood, his decision apparently made. Ben, ride to town, telegraph the marshal in Helena. Miguel, get the men together. We need to secure the ranch house and outbuildings. As the men hurried to obey, Jack turned to Grace. I'm sorry you're caught in this. Wallace has been threatening Thornfield for years, but I never thought he'd move so openly. Don't apologize, Grace said firmly. This is your home. You have every right to defend it. Something like surprise flickered across Jack's face, followed by determination. Mrs. Cooper, take care of Ambrose. Grace, I need to show you something. He led her to his father's study and unlocked a cabinet, revealing several rifles and revolvers. Can you shoot? Grace hesitated. My father taught me to use a small derringer for protection, but nothing like these. Jack nodded, selecting a revolver with a shorter barrel. This Colt's lighter than most. If Wallace's men come, I want you armed. He checked that the gun was loaded, then demonstrated how to cock and fire it, only as a last resort. Grace took the weapon, surprised by its weight despite Jack's claim of lightness. Do you really think they'll attack Thornfield? I think Wallace wants what he can't have, and that makes him dangerous. Jack's eyes met hers, intense and serious. I won't let anything happen to you, Grace. I promise. I'm not afraid, she replied, realizing as she said it that it was true. Not with you. For a moment they stood close together in the lamplight of the study, the weight of unspoken feelings between them as heavy as the revolver in Grace's hand. Then shouts from outside broke the spell, and Jack turned away, his focus shifting to the immediate threat. The next 2 days passed in tense preparation. Jack sent the youngest ranch hand, Charlie, to warn neighboring ranchers about Wallace's activities. The men worked to fortify the ranch buildings, moving horses to the corral nearest the house and positioning supplies where they would be accessible during a potential siege. Grace insisted on helping, working alongside Mrs. Cooper to prepare food that could be eaten quickly and stored easily. They filled every available container with water and gathered all medical supplies in one location. On the evening of the second day, Jack called everyone to the main house for a council. The atmosphere was grim as the ranch hands gathered around the dining table, faces serious beneath the lamplight. Marshall can't get here for at least a week, Jack informed them, standing at the head of the table. Snow's blocked the northern route, and he's dealing with a bank robbery in Virginia City. A week might be too late, Ben observed quietly. Which is why I'm giving you all a choice, Jack continued. This is my fight, not yours. Anyone who wants to leave has my blessing. I'll understand. The silence that followed was broken by old Tom, the eldest ranch hand who had worked for Jack's father before him. Thornfield's our home too, boss. We ain't going nowhere. Murmurs of agreement circled the table. Jack nodded, visibly moved by their loyalty. Then we need a plan. Wallace has the numbers, but we know this land better than his hired guns. As the men discussed strategy, Grace observed Jack. the natural authority he commanded, the respect he received from men twice his age. This was a side of him she hadn't fully seen before, and it stirred something deep within her. Behind his quiet exterior was a man of principle and courage, willing to risk everything to protect what he loved. The meeting concluded with watches assigned and defensive positions established. As the men dispersed to their duties, Jack approached Grace. "You should sleep in the root cellar tonight," he said quietly. "It's the safest place if shooting starts." "I'll help however I'm needed," Grace replied firmly. "I won't hide while everyone else is in danger." Jack studied her face, seeming to search for something. Whatever he saw apparently satisfied him. "You're a remarkable woman, Grace Sutton," he said finally. "Nothing like what I expected when I found you in that storm." "And what did you expect?" A small smile touched his lips. "A helpless city girl who'd faint at the first sign of trouble." "I believe I've proven otherwise," she said, matching his smile. "That you have." His expression grew serious again. "Grace, if anything happens tomorrow—" "Don't," she interrupted, placing her hand on his arm. "We'll face whatever comes together." Jack covered her hand with his, the simple contact sending warmth through her despite the circumstances. "Together," he agreed. That night Grace found sleep elusive. She stood by the window of her bedroom, looking out at the moonlit landscape of Thornfield. Snow reflected the silver light, making the world appear peaceful despite the threat hanging over them. A soft knock at her door startled her from her contemplation. "Yes," she called softly. "It's me," Jack's voice replied. "May I come in?" Grace hesitated only briefly before answering, "Yes." Jack entered, still fully dressed despite the late hour. He looked tired but alert, his revolver holstered at his hip. "I wanted to check on you," he said, remaining near the door, "and to give you this." He held out a folded piece of paper. "What is it?" Grace asked, taking it from him. "Deed to Thornfield. If something happens to me, I want you to have legal claim to the ranch. There's a letter explaining my wishes with my lawyer in town." Grace stared at the document in shock. "Jack, I can't accept this. Surely there must be family." "There's no one," he interrupted. "No family, no close friends outside the ranch, just me." His eyes held hers intently. "And you, now?" Jack, Grace was at a loss for words. The gesture was so enormous, so unexpected. "You don't have to say anything," he continued. "I just needed to know that Thornfield would go to someone who understands what it meant to my parents." "What it means to me." Grace carefully placed the deed on her dresser, then turned back to him. "Nothing will happen to you," she said with conviction she didn't entirely feel. "But I'm honored by your trust." Jack nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "I should let you rest," he said, though he made no move to leave. Grace took a step toward him. "I doubt either of us will sleep much tonight." "Probably not," he agreed, his voice dropping lower. Another step closer. "Jack, I need to tell you something." "Yes." "I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you." The words came out in a rush, as though she'd been holding them back for too long. "I know we've only known each other a short time, but these weeks at Thornfield, with you, have shown me what my life could be." Jack's expression transformed, hope and vulnerability replacing his careful reserve. "Grace, I never thought I'd want anyone in my life again. After my parents, I convinced myself it was safer to be alone." He moved toward her, closing the distance between them. "Then you appeared in that blizzard, and everything changed." His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his palm. "I love you, Grace Sutton. I think I've loved you since I found you in that storm." Grace leaned into his touch, her heart soaring despite the danger surrounding them. "I love you too, Jack Irwin. Whatever happens tomorrow, I wanted you to know that." Jack lowered his head slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. Instead, Grace rose on tiptoe to meet him, their lips coming together in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, filled with the emotion they'd been restraining for weeks. When they finally parted, Jack pressed his forehead to hers, his breathing unsteady. "I should go. Dawn will come too soon." Grace nodded reluctantly. "Be careful tomorrow." "I have something to live for now," he replied, brushing his lips against hers once more before stepping back. That makes a man particularly determined to survive. After he left, Grace returned to the window, her lips still tingling from his kiss, her heart full despite the uncertainty ahead. Whatever tomorrow brought, she now knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in this wild, beautiful land, with this strong, gentle man who had stolen her heart as surely as she had stolen his. Dawn broke cold and clear, the rising sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered yard of Thornfield Ranch. Grace stood on the porch with Jack, both of them scanning the distant ridgeline where the main trail descended into the valley. "Nothing yet," Jack said, lowering the spyglass he'd been using, "but they'll come. Wallace isn't a man to make idle threats." Grace nodded, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the morning chill. The revolver Jack had given her was hidden in the pocket of her skirt, its weight a constant reminder of the danger they faced. "The men are in position," she said. "Mrs. Cooper has prepared the infirmary in the back bedroom, just in case." Jack's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "You should go inside." "Not yet." Grace wanted to memorize every detail of his face in the clear morning light. The determined set of his jaw, the flecks of gold in his blue eyes, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar. The sound of a rider approaching fast from the eastern trail drew their attention. It was Charlie, the youngest ranch hand, returning from his mission to warn the neighbors. "They're coming," he called as he galloped into the yard. "Wallace and at least 15 men, less than an hour behind me." Jack's expression hardened. "Get inside, both of you. Tell the men to take their positions." Charlie dismounted and hurried to obey, but Grace lingered. "Jack." He turned to her, his face softening momentarily. "I know." "Me too." He pressed a swift kiss to her forehead. "Now go, please." Grace retreated reluctantly to the house, where Mrs. Cooper waited anxiously. Through the windows, she watched Jack striding toward the barn where several of the men had established a defensive position. "He's a good man," Mrs. Cooper said, joining her at the window, "just like his father." "Yes," Grace agreed softly, "the best man I've ever known." They waited in tense silence, minutes stretching like hours. Grace helped Mrs. Cooper prepare bandages, neither of them voicing the fear that they might soon be needed. The sound of multiple horses approaching finally broke the silence. Grace moved to the window, her heart pounding as she saw a large group of riders coming down the main trail toward Thornfield. At their head rode a large man on a black horse, Augustus Wallace, she presumed. Even from a distance he cut an imposing figure, broad-shouldered and confident in the saddle. Behind him his men spread out in a loose formation, all armed, their intentions clear even without words. Jack stepped out from the barn, rifle in hand but pointed downward, a gesture that was non-threatening while still making it clear he was armed. Ben and Old Tom flanked him, similarly equipped. Wallace reined in his horse about 20 yards from where Jack stood, holding up his hand to stop his men. "Irwin," his voice boomed across the yard. "I see you got my message." "Burning out Ambrose wasn't much of a message, Wallace," Jack called back, his voice steady. "More like a coward's way of doing business." Even from the house, Grace could see Wallace's face darken with anger. Strong words from a boy playing at being a rancher. "Your father understood the way of things out here. Shame he didn't live to teach you proper." "My father taught me that a man stands his ground against bullies," Jack replied. "Now state your business and get off my land." Wallace's laugh was ugly. "Your land." "This will be my land before sundown, boy. I'm giving you one chance to save the lives of your men. Sign over Thornfield to me, and you can all ride out unharmed." "Not going to happen, Wallace." The cattle baron's expression hardened. "Then I'll take it the hard way." He turned to his men. "Burn them out, kill anyone who resists." Everything happened at once. Wallace's men spurred their horses forward, guns already drawn. Jack and his men dove for cover as the first shots rang out. From various positions around the ranch buildings, the rest of Thornfield's defenders opened fire. Grace watched in horror as the peaceful morning erupted into violence. Wallace's men spread out, some dismounting to take cover behind the water trough and corral fencing, others circling toward the back of the house. "Get away from the windows, Mrs. Cooper pulled Grace down just as a bullet shattered the glass above them. Heart pounding, Grace crawled across the floor toward the back of the house. "We need to get to the root cellar," she urged Mrs. Cooper. The older woman nodded grimly, clutching a shotgun Grace hadn't noticed before. "I've lived through Indian raids and outlaw gangs," she said. "Never thought I'd see the day when rich men with hired guns became the worst danger on the frontier." They made their way cautiously toward the kitchen, where the entrance to the root cellar was located. Gunfire continued outside, punctuated by shouts and the frightened whinnying of horses. As they reached the kitchen, the back door suddenly splintered inward. Two of Wallace's men burst through, guns drawn. "Well, well," the first one sneered, seeing the women. "Look what we found." Mrs. Cooper raised her shotgun, but the second man was faster, knocking the weapon from her hands with a vicious blow that sent the older woman sprawling to the floor. "Mrs. Cooper," Grace cried, dropping to her knees beside the housekeeper who lay dazed but conscious. "Get them outside," the first man ordered. "Wallace wants Irwin to see what he stands to lose." The second man grabbed Grace roughly by the arm, hauling her to her feet. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the revolver Jack had given her. "Let go of me," she demanded, pointing the gun at her captor. The man laughed. "Look at this jade. The little lady thinks she's Annie Oakley." His mockery was cut short by the sound of the revolver cocking as Grace pulled back the hammer. "I said, let go." Something in her voice, the cold determination, perhaps, made the man release her arm and step back, his smile fading. "Now back away from Mrs. Cooper," Grace continued, the gun steady in her hand despite her racing heart. The men exchanged glances, clearly reconsidering their assessment of her. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, then shattered as Jack's voice called from outside. "Grace, Mrs. Cooper." The distraction was all the men needed. The first lunged forward, knocking Grace's arm upward as the revolver discharged into the ceiling. The second tackled her, pinning her arms as the gun clattered to the floor. "Bring her out," came a new voice from outside, deeper, commanding. "Wallace." Grace struggled as the men dragged her through the house and onto the front porch. The gunfire had died down, and an uneasy standoff seemed to be in progress. Jack and his men were positioned behind various forms of cover around the yard, while Wallace's men had similar protection. Two bodies lay motionless in the snow, one of Wallace's men, and to Grace's dismay, Miguel, his chest stained crimson. Wallace himself sat on his horse in the center of the yard, apparently confident that Jack wouldn't shoot him. His confidence only grew as Grace was brought forward, a gun pressed to her temple. "Irwin," Wallace called, "seems I've found your weakness." Jack's face, visible from where he crouched behind a water barrel, went deathly pale. "Let her go, Wallace. She has nothing to do with this." "On the contrary," Wallace replied, urging his horse forward, "I think she has everything to do with this. My men tell me you've grown quite fond of this lovely eastern flower." He studied Grace with calculated interest. "Can't say I blame you." "If you harm her," Jack began, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You'll what?" Wallace interrupted. "You're outnumbered and outgunned, boy, but I'm a reasonable man." He gestured expansively. "Sign over Thornfield and the lady lives. Simple as that." Grace caught Jack's eye across the yard, trying to convey with a look what she couldn't say aloud. "Don't do it. Don't give up your home." "Let her come to me first," Jack countered, slowly standing with his hands raised. "Then we'll talk terms." Wallace considered this, then nodded to the man holding Grace. "Let her go, but keep your gun on her. If Irwin tries anything, shoot her." The pressure of the gun barrel left Grace's temple, though the man kept a firm grip on her arm. "Walk slow," he hissed in her ear. Grace moved forward cautiously, her eyes never leaving Jack's. The snow crunched beneath her feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence that had fallen over the ranch yard. She was halfway to Jack when a commotion erupted from the ridge above the ranch. All eyes turned to see a group of at least 20 riders coming fast down the trail, rifles raised. "What the hell?" Wallace snarled, wheeling his horse around. The newcomers were a mix of men, some in ranchers' clothing, others in the garb of townspeople. At their head rode Charlie, the young ranch hand, and beside him a man wearing a marshal's badge. "That's far enough, Wallace," the marshal called as they thundered into the yard. "Drop your weapons, all of you." Wallace's face contorted with rage. "This doesn't concern you, Marshal." "Attacking a legal homestead concerns me plenty," the lawman replied, his rifle trained steadily on Wallace. "Now order your men to disarm, or I'll place you under arrest for attempted murder." For a tense moment it seemed Wallace might choose to fight. Then, seeing his men heavily outnumbered by the combined force of the marshal's posse and the neighboring ranchers Charlie had rallied, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "Stand down," he ordered his men grudgingly. The man holding Grace released her arm, and she ran the remaining distance to Jack, who caught her in a fierce embrace. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair. "Never," she replied, clinging to him as the tension of the standoff dissolved into the controlled chaos of the marshal's men disarming Wallace's gang. Later, as the marshal prepared to take Wallace and his men to Helena to face charges, Jack and Grace stood together on the porch of Thornfield Ranch, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. "It's over," Jack said, his arm around Grace's waist. "Wallace will be in prison for years after this." "What will happen to his ranch?" Grace asked, leaning into his warmth. "Probably be divided up among the small ranchers he forced out." Jack turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Which brings me to something I've been wanting to ask you." Grace's heart quickened at the seriousness in his expression. "Yes. When I found you in that storm, I was a man who believed the frontier was no place for love. That attachment only led to pain." Jack's blue eyes held hers intently. "You proved me wrong, Grace. You showed me that even in the harshest conditions, love can not only survive but thrive." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold ring. "This was my mother's. My father gave it to me before he died, said to save it for someone special." Jack dropped to one knee in the snow, still holding her hand. "Grace Sutton, will you marry me? Will you make Thornfield your home, our home, forever?" Tears of joy blurred Grace's vision as she nodded. "Yes, Jack, yes, with all my heart." Jack slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to pull her into his arms. As their lips met in a kiss that promised a lifetime together, Grace marveled at how a terrible storm had led her to the greatest blessing of her life. A man who had taught her the true meaning of home, and a love that would endure through whatever challenges the frontier might bring. Spring came to Montana in a riot of wildflowers and new growth. The snow melted from the valleys, revealing lush grass that turned the landscape emerald green. Calving season brought new life to Thornfield Ranch, keeping everyone busy from dawn to dusk. On the first truly warm day of May, beneath an azure sky that matched Jack's eyes, Grace Sutton became Grace Irwin in a ceremony held on the porch of Thornfield Ranch. Mrs. Cooper had decorated the railings with wildflowers and ribbons, and every rancher for 20 miles had come to celebrate, along with Grace's Aunt Margaret from Helena, who had arrived with begrudging approval for her niece's choice. "He's a fine young man," the older woman admitted as she helped Grace prepare, "though I had hoped you might marry a businessman or lawyer in Helena." Grace smiled, smoothing the simple white dress she'd ordered from the mercantile in town. "I found something better, Aunt Margaret. I found love and purpose in a place where I truly belong." As she walked toward Jack, who waited for her looking handsome and somewhat awestruck in a new suit, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the comfortable but empty life in Philadelphia, through the terror of the blizzard, to this moment of perfect happiness. Jack took her hands in his eyes never leaving hers as they spoke their vows before the preacher who had ridden out from town. When he kissed her as his wife for the first time, the cheers of their friends and neighbors filled the clear spring air. That evening, after the celebration had ended and their guests had departed, Jack and Grace stood together on the porch where they had been married, looking out over the land that was now truly theirs together. "Happy Mrs. Irwin?" Jack asked, his arms encircling her from behind. "Completely," Grace replied, leaning back against his chest, "though there is one more thing that would make today perfect." What's that? She turned in his arms to face him, taking his hand and placing it gently on her stomach. In about 7 months, Thornfield will have a new heir. Jack's expression transformed from confusion to wonder to joy in the space of a heartbeat. A baby. We're going to have a baby. Grace nodded, laughing as Jack lifted her off her feet and spun her around. Careful, she protested through her laughter. Your son or daughter might object to such treatment. Jack set her down gently, his face radiant with happiness. I love you, Grace Irwin. More than I ever thought possible. And I love you, Jack Irwin, she replied, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. Thank you for finding me in that storm. As twilight deepened into night, the lights of Thornfield Ranch glowed warm and welcoming against the vast Montana landscape. Inside, a family had begun, born of an unexpected meeting in a blizzard, forged through trials and danger, and now looking forward to a future filled with love and purpose on the land they both cherished. For Jack, who had once believed that the frontier was no place for love, and Grace, who had traveled west seeking only security, their union was proof that the greatest treasures are often found where we least expect them, sometimes even in the heart of a storm.